Have you ever heard of the middle name Pay It No Mind? Well, Marsha P. Pay It No Mind Johnson was a queer person and drag queen who was assigned male at birth, but she loved to dress in women's clothing. While young, she was unable to express herself as she was constantly bullied and was sexually assaulted by a 13-year-old boy. But after she graduated high school, she regained her identity by adopting the new name of Marsha P. Johnson. The P, standing for Pay It No Mind, became her life motto. Marsha P. Johnson was a gay liberation activist that took great part in the Stonewall riots. I have personally dealt with my own queer identity since I was in middle school, and researching the history of the LGBT rights has helped me get closer to accepting myself. Many of you probably have associated or met someone part of the LGBT community. According to the UCLA Williams Institute, based on the 2020-21 Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System data, 13.9 million Americans identify as LGBT. It is important to know about the events that have paved the way to our society today. In this speech, I will inform you about the importance of the Stonewall Uprising. We will first explore the history of what Stonewall was. Then we'll talk about what the significance to the future it brought. And lastly, we will close off with some experiences of LGBT people had to experience during this time. So what is Stonewall, and why is it so important? So Stonewall was a pivotal moment in history that sparked movement for equality. According to the Library of Congress, before Stonewall, there was a homophile movement, which refers to the local, national, and international social political movement for gay and lesbian rights, which emerged following World War II. There were conservatives' estimates about 60 homophile or gay rights groups operating across the country. This means that LGBT presence has always been here. So bars were one of the few places that existed for LGBT people to gather in public. So by 1969, the Stonewall Inn bar was one of the most popular bars in New York. However, homosexuality was considered a criminal offense, so LGBT spaces were often subject to police raids. With these raids came violence by the police against those who were arrested. So many of those who survived police raids were hospitalized or suffered injuries, and many of them, innumerable LGBTQ people, suffered death by the police raids on gay spaces. The Stonewall Uprising began in the early hours of June 28, 1969, when the New York City Police raided the Stonewall Inn. This time, the LGBT people were fed up with police violence and their social discrimination. So the raid sparked in a riot among the bar patrons and neighborhood residents as police roughly hauled the employees and the patrons of the bar. This led to 6 days of protests and violent clashes with the law enforcement. The Stonewall served as a catalyst for the gay movements in the United States. So Stonewall left its legacy and was a galvanizing force for LGBT political activism. So how did it shape the future? In the weeks following Stonewall, activists in New York organized the Gay Liberation Front, and a few months later, the Gay Activist Alliance was founded in December 1969, both fighting for the protection of the LGBT members. On the one-year anniversary of the riots, on June 28, 1970, thousands of people marched in the streets of Manhattan. This became the first, America's first Pride Parade. And then from then on, the marches spread across the world and the U.S. and for decades it still stands now. Although Stonewall was a huge opening for gay rights, it wasn't a speedy progress. As the American University of Washington says, it took decades to reverse U.S. laws that were discriminatory against LGBT populations. It wasn't until 2015 when the Supreme Court finally legalized gay marriage. And in 2016, President Obama recognized the Stonewall Inn as a national landmark. Now let's talk about what was it like to experience being LGBT and living during this era. So gay people during this time experienced extreme hardships. As I stated before, homosexuality was illegal in the United States. So the 1960s were a dark age for lesbians and gays all over America. There was an overwhelming number of medical authorities who said that homosexuality was a mental disease, as said in the Stonewall Riot PBS documentary. This led to a series of queer people having to be sentenced to medical institutions, where they had to go under psychiatric procedures such as aversive conditioning, sterilizations, and sometimes lobotomies. During this era, being gay seemed to be the worst possible thing you could do. If queer people were caught by the police and were identified as being involved in what was called immoral behavior, the police would get their name, their age, and their addresses published in the big newspapers. So this subjected queer people to being discriminated against, being called slurs, and had to face violence. And while queer people were still preyed upon, bars became a safe space for the community to find people who understood them and did not discriminate against them. From the PBS documentary, Stonewall Riot, Dick Leitch relates gay bars being to gay people what churches were to black folks in the South. So the history of Stonewall, its significance, and the experiences of queer people all shape the importance of what this event stands for. Marsha P. Johnson, again, who I mentioned in the beginning of this speech, was one of the first to lead the protests that after the raid. She was known as the Rosa Parks of the LGBTQ liberation movement, but her body was found in the Hudson River on July 6, 1992. It was initially ruled as a suicide, but her family members and friends suspected it was foul play. However, to this day, the police have not found the real cause to her death. So with the month of June coming up and the Pride parades starting up again, keep this in mind. Keep the legacy of Stonewall uprising in mind and the many lives of those LGBTQ people that died. Thank you.